Hi, I'm Wendy Turner, Executive Director of Michigan Public. You might have heard that public media is under threat. You're not wrong. But I come to tell you that your voice has power. Visit protectmypublicmedia.org, contact your lawmakers, and take a stand today.
From Michigan Public, this is It's Just Politics. I'm Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
The new special committee in the Michigan House working to change the state's minimum wage and sick time leave laws is meeting for the first time in Lansing.
On February 21st, our restaurant workers, our family-owned small businesses, and the future of literally thousands of jobs in our state will pay the price if our legislature does not act.
On today's show, we will speak with both the committee chair and a stakeholder who doesn't want any changes to the petition-initiated laws.
We really should look at these proposals and see the value and judge them accordingly.
But first, Rick, a big announcement this week in Michigan politics in the race for the state's highest office.
Michiganders deserve so much better than what they're getting from these Democrats up in Lansing.
That is Aric Nesbitt, Republican minority leader in the state Senate, announcing their Tuesday morning vis-a-vis a video announcement that he is running for governor in 2026. Rick, this was a pretty open secret that Nesbitt was going to run, like when you do all those lists of who's going to, who's not. He really always sort of was top of the list, at least in Republican land.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And he's kind of, even though he is a minority leader in the Senate, he's tried to set himself up as sort of the bête noire for Gretchen Whitmer and the things that she's been trying to do. He's always been out there speaking against it.
Who is he? What's his background?
He likes to call himself a farm boy.
Mm-hmm.
He grew up in Southwest Michigan, and he's I think a seventh generation farmer. But really, politics has been his passion.
Right. In 2010, he was elected to the House of Representatives for the first time. He served for 3 terms. Then in 2018, he ran for the Senate. So he's in his second term in that upper chamber. And again, as we noted, for the past 2 years, he's been the minority leader.
Yeah, he will have some trouble running against career politicians if he tries to go down that path.
Well, and I mean, some of that he talked about in this video. Let's take another little listen here to this announcement.
We need to end Whitmer's electric vehicle mandates. Stand with President Trump to bring back a renaissance on manufacturing here in Michigan. Investing in jobs in Detroit or Saginaw or Flint instead of jobs in Mexico and China. Ban sanctuary cities to make sure that our communities and families are safe. Defend our Second Amendment to protect our individual freedoms.
So, Rick, one of the things right after we watched it, you noted to me, this was pretty red meat, Republican red meat. This is appealing to Republicans. This is not a general election audience.
Yeah. Anti-Whitmer, pro-gun, anti-tax. I mean, just everything that you would expect to hear from someone who's trying to win a Republican primary. Absolutely.
And we should just remind folks, this is an open race, meaning we're likely going to see a ton more names on both the Republican and Democratic side because Whitmer is term limited. She cannot run again. Now, no Democrats have announced yet, but we did late last year have Mike Duggan, the mayor of Detroit, jump in, surprising many by deciding he was going to run as an independent. And on the Democratic side, also, Jocelyn Benson seems to be dipping her toe in with tweets on X.
Talk about another open secret. And Mike Cox has formed what's called an exploratory committee, which is really just a campaign committee by another name. It allows him to go out and do a lot of candidate activities and fundraise and things like that. So I think it's pretty safe to say that he has all but announced that he's running. And Benson and Cox and Nesbitt, that they are not going to be the final people to come out in their respective primary fields. Going to be other candidates.
Okay, and we are going to keep an eye on them. It is early in 2025 talking about election 2026, but again, an open race. It's going to take up a lot of oxygen in Lansing and really statewide over the next 2 years. A special Republican-led state House committee opened hearings this week. They're focusing on scaling back an increase to the tipped wage and guaranteeing workers paid sick leave. We're going to speak with the committee chair momentarily. But first, Rick, you spoke briefly with Danielle Atkinson. She is with Mothering Justice, and this is an organization that's pushing for no changes to these laws.
And I started by asking Atkinson what she thinks the committee ought to do with these two initiatives.
So really think they should do nothing. It should be put together of people that support both paid sick time and eliminating a sub-minimum wage, and really should look at these proposals and see the value and judge them accordingly. Whether or not this would bring greater financial stability to the majority of Michiganders, whether or not it would insulate people against having to go to work when they're sick, whether or not it would protect public safety. And that's the litmus test, not whether or not businesses are upset with it.
There are also servers, for example, who are saying that they could lose their jobs if the tipped wage initiative is enacted as is. Why are they wrong if they're wrong?
Yeah, they're not. They're not wrong in their beliefs because they have been fed a lie by the Restaurant and Lodging Association mainly, and then by other business lobbyist organizations. We can do the math on the back of a napkin and know that this is good for servers. Actually, a few years ago, I was up in Lansing during one of these lobby days that the Restaurant and Lodging Association put on, and I pulled a server aside who was brought up there, and I said, let's go through a day's pay and whether or not this would be good for you or bad for you, and then also talk to you about what has happened in other states. After a brief conversation about saying this does not close businesses, we have not seen that effect in other states. We have seen an increase in wages and stability for workers, and we know that this doesn't affect tipping. People still will tip. They still have the same attitudes around tipping. And once we had that conversation, they were like, yeah, I really hope this goes into effect. Unfortunately, I'm up here because my boss drove me up here, but I'm for this.
You say that you know this. You know how this would play out. How do you know this?
Yeah, because there are several states that have already enacted this. If we really look at what a sub-minimum wage is and how people live off of that, we know that it is not sustainable. We know that it is out of step with the beliefs of Michiganders as to how people should work and live. And we know that other states have enacted these laws and not seen the negative sky is falling impacts that the Restaurant Association is wanting us to believe.
So in the end, what would you like to see the product of this committee be?
You know, I think knowing who is on the committee, knowing that the individuals are not supportive of these issues, I would like them to have a wait and see mentality. Let these laws go into effect, these laws that we have been preparing for 8 years. The only individuals that have not been preparing for this are the organizations that claim to represent restaurants, and they have not been preparing their restaurants for it. But the rest of us have been informing the public. The state of Michigan has been so helpful in preparing the resources that employers need to be able to comply with this law. And I would like them to wait and see and have it go into effect. See if there is a great impact, monitor it at 20 days, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and then act accordingly. I also am not against them listening to small businesses around what resources they could use to implement this law. But we know that for the greater good of the state of Michigan, for people who are just trying to make ends meet, this is important to do, and we are behind the times and the attitudes of Michiganders.
Danielle Atkinson with Mothering Justice, thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Rick.
So let's then turn now to the chair of the Select Committee on Protecting Michigan Employees and Small Businesses, Republican Representative Bill G. Schuette. Welcome.
Hey, appreciate the opportunity to talk with you both. A big fan of the show.
Representative, what's the goal of this committee?
Yeah, I think the goal of this committee is to make sure that we're, one, listening, and that's listening to whether it's restaurant workers, small business owners, people in favor of this legislation, opposed to this legislation, but really make sure that we're having a collaborative committee process on what is a looming cliff facing Michigan small businesses and employees. And that's what's really an unworkable sick time top-down policy that's being forced onto businesses across our state come February, and an elimination of the tip credit that I think will really rob Michigan restaurant workers of their hard-earned tips. So the goal of this committee is to listen, evaluate the legislative proposals that we have out there, and then hopefully move something to the floor that's a solution that protects Michigan workers and small businesses.
Well, let's talk about what's legislatively workable. How much of this is figuring out what you can do in the House, controlled by Republicans like you, versus figuring out what you can get through a Democratic Senate and signed by a Democratic governor?
Yeah. I think you're right. We're in a brave new world here in the 103rd legislature in the year 2025. But, Rick, what I would point to is this time last month, Democrats in the Senate said there was nothing wrong with the sick time policy that was coming out and eliminating the tip credit. And then come January and opening day of the new legislature, they introduced legislative fixes. Obviously, I think the House version is better policy, but I think that shows the conversation has already shifted. And you saw the governor comment that she would be willing to sign something that would address this issue. So I think we're already seeing these negotiations take place, and I think that's a credit to the strong advocacy of small business owners and workers across our state.
How many Democrats in the House do you think you have who will join Republicans in a final vote?
Yeah, I thought if you were listening to the committee testimony, favorable comments from some of the Democrats on the committee. I think in the conversations that I've had, I've heard people tell me privately that they support the legislation that we have and the work of the committee. I hope that translates into public votes. But what we're going to continue to work on is, again, having a good legislative process. That's why, Zoe, I could have, rammed both of these bills through the committee and held no testimony, right? We could have easily done that. I could have only heard testimony from those who were in favor of the legislation. But I think it's important that we have a collaborative committee process, that we restore to the legislature that type of procedure. And I'm hoping that helps us forge a bipartisan consensus.
Well, that's, sort of my follow-up question, right? We have seen, particularly when you see a deadline of folks sort of saying we have to get this done, legislation that has been pushed through chambers very quickly. How much of this do you know is something that's going to happen versus how much of this is actually sort of sausage making in real time right now?
So, Zoe, my favorite quote from the legendary basketball coach John Wooden is to be quick, but don't hurry, right? We're going to be efficient in our legislative process. That's why, the very first two bills that the House Republicans introduced was on this issue. The first committee that was named, the first committee hearing is on this topic. And on Thursday, we've already posted to have another committee meeting of this on this issue. So we're definitely not dragging our feet. We're going to make sure that we're doing this right, because what you don't want to do, pass a fix that doesn't address all the issues or creates its own host of problems. So we're going to be deliberative, but we're also going to be direct, and we're going to make sure we fix this the right way.
What level of confidence do you have that you can get the sorts of changes that you're talking about to these laws done and ready for a signature before February 21st?
I'm confident that we're going to get a bill through the House, and I think then what it's going to be on is making sure that we continue this dialogue with the governor and with the Senate, and that's going to be, again, I look to where this narrative has shifted from where we were in June to where we were in December to where we are here now in January. It seems like the legislature works best on a deadline, and I'm not saying that's how things should be, but it seems like it's often how things are. And I think the fact that we have a looming deadline, if that's what it takes, I know that we'll use every single bit of pressure it takes to solve this.
Representative, oftentimes, though, when we do see something that is taking up so much oxygen in Lansing and when there is a deadline, sometimes at the last minute, because folks know there is that pressure, things can get added into negotiations. Do you have any fear that somehow, as Republicans and Democrats are working on this, that someone might bring up another issue and sort of tie that into these negotiations?
Yeah, there's always that risk. But again, I think that's why we're trying to keep this focused on the task at hand. And that's the hard-earned tips of restaurant workers. And that's making sure that our family-owned small businesses are able to operate successfully in our state. And I think this is too important of an issue to play games.
But what about the people who don't want these changes? The campaigns who worked on this, the people who signed petitions, the experts who've said this has worked in other states, and that the fair thing to do is to see how this works in Michigan and then make changes if it doesn't work.
Yeah, so a couple of things on that. One, the group that is leading the advocacy for this, we heard their testimony, and this is a group that's based in California, and where it has successfully implemented its advocacy in other states. We've seen how it's decimated the restaurant industry from areas from Chicago. We've seen District of Columbia. We saw Massachusetts reject this, not because of the damaging impact that would have. And frankly, to say that what we need to do is let all these businesses close and then go back and fix it, that's too late, right? These Black-owned businesses, these family-owned restaurants, they're not going to be able to be like, oh, well, now that the policy's changed, I'm going to be able to reopen. No, it's going to be too late for them. So we really have to make sure that we're being preemptive, not reactive on this.
But there are also examples of places where this has not been a failure. These petitions were signed by voters. What do you say to those voters?
I think, what I would say is that the job of the current legislature is to represent the people. And what we're doing is we're listening. And we've heard overwhelming testimony. And we've seen overwhelming evidence. This is going to be damaging to business owners. This is going to be damaging to restaurant workers. And it's going to lead to fewer jobs and closing of lots of family-owned enterprises across the state of Michigan. And that's what you elect a legislature to do. And, the Supreme Court, I disagreed with the ruling. But one aspect of the ruling, obviously, that, I did agree with is they said, hey, the current legislature can act. And I think it's incumbent upon this current legislature to act.
Well, with that point, I mean, there's been some Democrats who have basically said to Republicans, sort of vis-a-vis that Supreme Court decision, look, you guys decided to try this maneuver, adopt and amend. You messed around and found out. Messed around being the public radio version of that phrase.
No. I appreciate the clean edit version here. No, I think, again, I would, you can get caught in finger pointing here. I think that the legislature at the time was working on solid footing based on, past precedent and a strong attorney general opinion. That opinion was upheld by the Court of Appeals, and obviously the Supreme Court made a ruling that a lot of people disagree with. But instead of saying, hey, this is the fault of the legislature, and me saying, hey, this is the fault of the Supreme Court, I'm focused on solution, I'm focused on fixes.
We're speaking with Republican State Representative Bill G. Schuette. He is the chair of the Select Committee on Protecting Michigan Employees and Small Businesses. The first committee hearings underway this week in Lansing. So, Representative, while we still have you here, aside from the committee, I want to just talk a little broader about Lansing right now. You, of course, were elected in 22. So you came into office in January of 2003. That was the huge, historic Democratic trifecta, the first time Democrats had complete control of Lansing in 40 years. What's it like now? What's the difference been going from your first 2 years in minority to now being in majority and chairing a select committee?
Yeah, it certainly was not how I planned to start my legislative career, being in the first Republican complete minority in 40 years. But you know what I think what it did do is it gave me an insight into how process works in the legislature, sometimes how it should work, and oftentimes how it shouldn't work. And I think from that really helped me view how I wanted to run this select committee. And it was the first committee that I chaired, but I wanted to make sure that people from both sides had time to testify, that members of the majority and the minority had time to ask questions, because we saw, frankly, that was not how things were done last term. And now it's on us. It's on us to do better. And I'm hoping that today was a step of doing just that.
Your father, of course, is a longtime politico in Michigan, most recently having been the state's attorney general for 8 years. You really sort of grew up in Michigan politics. You know the scene. But what's something that still surprised even you about Lansing?
It's kind of funny. Even somebody who was sort of born and baptized in the flames of Lansing, it was it was surprising to me. We can kind of have this Mr. Smith goes to Washington or Lansing view of the legislature, where I was my first day, I was still waiting for everybody to just sit back and hear the poetic speeches from the House floor. And then I realized it's more like my big fat Greek wedding, where everybody's going around talking and it's organized chaos. So that was certainly an interesting, aspect for it. But again, it's all part of the process, and it's an honor to be able to represent the people of Mid-Michigan in the legislature.
One of the things that we saw in the final weeks of lame duck was really, all these sort of headlines, Democrats in disarray, the inability to sort of hold the caucus together. There's been a lot said about Matt Hall, the new Republican speaker, and his ability to hold the caucus together. What do you credit for that being able to be so?
Yeah. And again, I've had the opportunity to know Speaker Hall for a long time. He likes to joke around that, when my sister was going through driver's training, he was seated in the back seat when he was working with my dad on the Attorney General's race. So I've been able to know Matt for a long time, and I consider him a close friend. And it's great to see him serving as the speaker right now. And I think the reason he was really able to keep our caucus together was because he's been communicated a strong vision, and he's also listened and been collaborative in that process. And I think what that has allowed is when we, decide to take a step and work as a caucus, we're unified, we have that vision. And that's why I was, proud to cast my vote for Speaker Hall and look forward to see what the next 2 years have.
Finally, before we let you go, because I know you got to get back to committee prep, but we have to ask about a possible open Senate seat and a possibility of you running for that open Senate seat. Of course, now Congresswoman Karen McDonald-Rivet left her state Senate seat. She is now Congresswoman representing Dan Kildey's former seat in D.C. That Senate seat, man, that is part of your district. Will you run once Governor Gretchen Whitmer announces a special election?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and it's obviously something that's on the tops of a lot of different discussions around Lansing. What I would say right now is we're a long way away from a filing deadline that doesn't exist yet, right? It's incumbent on the governor to call a special election, and I hope she does, because right now, there's more than 250,000 people in Michigan who are unrepresented in the state Senate, and that's not fair. So first, we need the governor to call the special election, and obviously it'll be something I take a look at. But first and foremost, I'm focused on doing my job here in the State House, and that involves making sure that we fix this tip credit and sick time issue, and that'll be where I remain focused right now.
Republican Representative Bill G. Schuette, thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate the time.
Thank you. And that is It's Just Politics for today. I am Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
Let's talk again next week.